political analyst and specialist in the Middle East and in Iran. Also by Sanam Shantyaei, who's a France24 journalist and also a specialist of Iran. We're joined from Washington by Robert Zarate, who's a policy director at the Foreign Policy Initiative, and from Lund in Sweden by Rouzbeh Parsi, who's a senior lecturer at Lund University. Picking up where we left off a moment ago, Sanam, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei made clear yesterday that not much was likely to come from these talks. Surely an indication, given that he is the man at the helm of the whole thing, and particularly of any discussions on Iran's nuclear program, that very little should be expected.
He is indeed the highest power in the Islamic Republic, and he did say that the talks won't go anywhere. But that was in the context of a comment that he made earlier saying that Iran will absolutely abide by its commitments to the nuclear deal. So we have to keep that in mind. In addition to that, going back to a comment made by Mr. Zarate earlier, I understand that the hardliners and hawks will see this as an opportunity for Iran to push the boundaries and perhaps cross these red lines. But we have to remember that specifically within the 6-month interim period, because of the intense and strict inspection that Iran's nuclear facilities are being exposed to, it won't be able to actually push those boundaries. So I don't believe that we need to be that pessimistic about these talks.
Robert Zarate, if these talks allow at least for more inspection, a clearer view of what's happening within Iran's nuclear program, then surely they will have been worth holding.
To a point, I think there are a couple issues here. One, there's a nomenclature issue that I want to throw on the table. One, I often hear people talk about hardliners in Tehran and hardliners in Washington, D.C. You know, whatever hardliners there are in Washington, D.C., they're not executing poets. In Tehran, we recently saw renowned Iranian poet Hashem Shahbani executed after 3 years of detainment and torture and the like for alleged waging war on God and spreading corruption on faith. That's the sort of hardliner you see in Iran. You don't see anything compared to that in Washington, D.C. What you see, the so-called hardliners in Washington, D.C., they want to see negotiations proceed from a shrewd and sensible point of view. And they want an agreement that really does cap and limit Iran's capability to build a nuclear weapon on short notice. What troubles me here is this rhetoric from Iran saying that they're not going to dismantle a single centrifuge, that they're not going to dismantle a single nuclear facility. That flies in the face of just analysis and facts. And one fact is that you've heard actually in recent weeks from David Albright of the Institute, ISIS, Institute for Science and International Studies. David Albright said that if Iran is going to have a breakout capability of anywhere from a year plus, Iran has to get rid of roughly 15,000 centrifuges from its 18,000 installed, 19,000 installed centrifuges. That's if you want a 1 year to a year and a half window from Iran building a nuclear weapon. Currently today, Iran, if it decided to, could build a nuclear weapon in as few as 6 weeks, perhaps even less, depending on the amount of foreign assistance it's getting from states like North Korea and the like. And so there are real metrics here for success. And what's troubling for me, again, is this, you're not hearing this from President Obama. President Obama himself is actually being very flexible, doesn't want to lay out red lines. You're not hearing that from Khamenei or from Rouhani. And this is a recipe for disaster. This is why Fareed Zakaria, after interviewing Rouhani, said that we're right now on trajectory for a train wreck. Iran is unwilling to concede and actually take seriously the legitimate concerns of the international community, concerns that are codified in at least 6 UN Security Council resolutions.
Milad Jokar, I'd like to put that to you, that in order to bring Iran's ability to build, should it choose to do so, nuclear bomb within limits that are acceptable to the rest of the world, centrifuges would have to go, which is something that Tehran said it won't consider.
Mm-hmm. This is indeed one of the points that will be dealt with in the comprehensive agreement, the number of centrifuges. So as we know, Iran has 20,000 centrifuges, and among these centrifuges, 1,000 are second-generation centrifuges, so they're enriched much faster. And I believe that Western diplomats would like Iran to have around a few thousand centrifuges, 4,000 centrifuges. So they will give maybe more confidence in order to sign a final deal, but this will have to be temporary because Iran will refuse to be, treated differently as part of a non-proliferation treaty signatory.
But it will have to accept the closing of centrifuges.
Closing centrifuges is like temporarily. They could, as a confidence-building measure, indeed accept not to enrich with their 10,000 centrifuges that are currently enriching, but this would have to be for a temporary deal. After this, Iran will probably put this on the table. This will be part of the negotiations, but dismantling them, this is maybe a maximalist position to demand Iran dismantling their nuclear facilities.
There seem to be, Rouzbeh Parsi, the more one looks at the actual concrete nature of the issues that will have to be discussed this week in Vienna, the more one doubts that any agreement can surely be found. Wendy Sherman, the Undersecretary of State, made clear that the question of Iran's ballistic capability would have to be considered. Iran has made clear it won't talk about its defense at all. She's also said that Iran did not need its reactor in Iraq, nor did it need its site at Fordo. All issues that for Tehran are absolutely not on the table for discussion.
Well, I mean, first of all, let me just make a point. Hardliners in DC or hardliners in Tehran, I have no reason to trust any one of them, and I don't think it's particularly useful to try and do a body count of how many people they might have ended up killing. I think that discussion is for another time. As for the process, we have to remember that this is a process. So whatever everyone comes in with in terms of demands and red lines and postering and whatnot at this point is not what they're going to end up getting when the process is over. So they come in now with all kinds of more or less, imaginary ideas of how much they should get and how little they should pay for it. But in 6 months' time or in 12 months' time, if they prolong it, what they have at that point is what counts. So there's no point in kind of declaring this process dead because someone said something yesterday. We will see how that works out in time. I think what's important for Iran is that its right to enrichment is accepted and is put in the final agreement. And then it will be a question of what is politically affordable in terms of how much actual technical material it should have for that enrichment. Then whether Wendy Sherman says that they shouldn't have this place or that place, I mean, this is something that they do now. But in the long run, obviously no state is going to allow someone else to decide whether you are allowed to have a certain facility or not. The main important point here is that whatever facilities Iran are going to end up actually having in operation should be under very, very strict safeguards that go beyond the Non-Proliferation Treaty, includes the additional protocol. At the end, and we're not talking 12 months here, we're talking perhaps in 5 years' time, when everyone knows that everything has gone well and everyone has done what they promised to do, at that point, Iran will then be considered a normal signatory of the NPT and will be under the same kind of safeguards as everyone else. Up until then, it will be additional safeguards, which Iran will then have to accept, but it will accept it under the condition that it's getting something for it, which is the sanctions relief bit.
I'll put that question of sanctions relief to you, Sanam, in just a moment. First of all, though, I want to put to Robert Zarate that scenario that was just described there. The right to uranium enrichment is recognized by the rest of the world. Confidence-building measures are put in place. Transparency is the watchword. And over time, relations with the rest of the world will be sufficiently normalized that Iran's nuclear program will no longer pose a threat, imagined or real, to anyone.
You know, I spent my early career working on nuclear non-proliferation in Congress, and I want to clear up something here, that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty does not enshrine the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of weapons nuclear material that you can convert into a bomb on short notice. The right to enrichment, and President Obama himself said this, I believe, in November 2013, or late October. The NPT does not expressly enumerate enrichment as a per se right. It does allow for the right for nuclear energy for peaceful purposes in accordance with international inspections and the like, but it doesn't offer a per se right to enrich. But what this whole discussion elides is, again, 3 letters, PMD, potential military dimensions. This is why we're even here having this discussion, because for 3 decades, Iran hid nuclear activities and cooperated with the likes of A.Q. Khan. And moreover, again, there is an established history of Iran conducting weapons-relevant nuclear experiments on military facilities. These are questions that there will have to be a full answer in the international community, and until that sort of thing happens, I don't think a deal would be accepted here, certainly by the Congress, the U.S. Congress, but it just wouldn't pass a smell test. Where I actually see this going, by the way, this whole negotiation process, I think there's going to be a punting. 6 months will become 12 months. 12 months could become 2 years, and we'll be in this all drawn-out negotiating process. The parallel, of course, here is to the agreed framework with North Korea, which Wendy Sherman actually helped to negotiate in the 1990s. Well, we all know where that led to. North Korea today has nuclear weapons, and I think this is why you see the worries here today in Washington, D.C., and among congressional lawmakers, both on the right and on the left.
Sanam Shantyaei, on that question of sanctions relief, this is, of course, what Iran needs. This is what Iran wants. You've been to the country before, and more recently. It is the pressure on Hassan Rouhani is definitely from the state of his economy. He'll be coming under intense pressure over the next few days, weeks, months, however long these negotiations take, to get to a situation where sanctions are lifted on Iran totally.
Absolutely. The back-breaking sanctions that battered the country's economy, as I mentioned earlier, are essentially what brought Iran to the negotiation table in the first place. And this is what they're after. Iran has already opened itself up to businesses with its Western counterparts, as we saw in earlier February. A delegation of around 110 business companies headed by MEDEF went to Iran to eye up business opportunities for themselves. So this is a two-way deal, yes. Iran is suffering massively. I mentioned the inflation, unemployment, even shortage of medicine, which is really unfortunate in a country like Iran. So they will, of course, be benefiting from the lifting of sanctions, and this will be a massive victory for Rouhani, who vowed in his election campaign that that's what he'll bring to the country. But it's also a fantastic opportunity for the West, so that they can, we had the French car makers, for example, Peugeot and Renault, who were losing out on revenue because they had to cut business ties with Iran. So it's brilliant for both sides to be able to establish some kind of agreement.
Milad Jokar, of course, there are the Western foreign business interests keen to get back into an Iran with normalized relations with the rest of the world. But the real pressure economically is, of course, on Iran. Sanctions have crippled it. The currency has lost 2/3 of its value. The economy is in a disastrous state. I read one, and it's difficult to have proper estimates, but one organization here in France estimated that 1 in 2 Iranian people now lived beneath the poverty line. Hassan Rouhani has no choice, does he, but to find the deal that he can with these powers this time.
Absolutely. There's a lot of expectation within the Iranian population, but I just wanted to come back to a previous comment on our guest in Washington. I think we all agree that, and even the intelligence community agrees, that the comparison between North Korea and Iran is nonsense, simply because there are inspectors on the ground in Iran, in Iranian nuclear facilities. What is need to be done is to have more inspectors, to have full transparency measures.
And more access.
And more access, absolutely. And as Rouzbeh Parsi said, they would have to agree to sign the additional protocol that will be signed by the Iranian parliament. But the comparison between North Korea and Iran, I think, is something to make people afraid of the Iranian nuclear program, and it is not really related to the real negotiations on the table. Coming back to Iran's economy, absolutely, there's a lot of expectation. I was in Iran also in September and October. And everybody agrees that, absolutely, we want to have a better image. Rouhani is working on this. He was elected by 51.7% of the electors, voters, and on a program of opening the country to the West, better relations with the Arab neighbors, and engagement, moderation. And this is why, as Sanam just said, they are inviting businesses, the business community, to invest in Iran. And this invitation and motivation from the business community can also be used, and the Iranians understand this, as leverage to pressure different governments to lift sanctions.
Rouzbeh Parsi, I'd like to go back to one point that Milad Jokar made just a moment ago. And first of all, we have a tweet for you. Rouzbeh Parsi is making the most realistic analysis around talks. Can we send him to Vienna and get the hardliners out of the way there? They're sending you to Vienna already on that question of the hardliners and the comparisons made with North Korea. Isn't fundamentally the question that Tehran is going to have to answer sooner or later, that of the hardliners in Washington in particular? It is going to have to answer the question about whether it is or is not seeking to make a nuclear bomb. That is fundamentally the question at the heart of the negotiations, and the thing on which it is going to have to come clean. It meant some way towards it by accepting last week of the IAEA that it would allow the organization to look into detonators that may have been built with a view to building a bomb. In the end, that is the question on the table in Vienna.
Well, 2 points. First of all, yes, of course, what this is about for everyone who is involved in this outside of Iran is to make sure that Iran is not building a nuclear bomb. But it's a question of how you go about doing that. You see, if we were just to say that, well, we won't allow this, we won't allow that, we are also, in a sense, claiming that we have the power to stop it all in all, and we don't. I mean, unless the people in the US Congress have the treasury and the men to start a new war, a third one in the Middle East, we have to be realistic about how we go about ensuring that Iran does not get a nuclear bomb. So that has to be part of the process. And it has to be part of the process, of course, that they come clean on whatever it is they tried to do before. That's obvious. No one is claiming that they're going to get a free pass for what they did. But it's a question of understanding that most of the things that were weapons related, according to basically every intelligence organization that has publicized this in one way or another, was in the past. And we want them to tell us exactly what they did. But if we are going to tell them that if you tell us what you did, we're going to punish you for whatever it is you did, then obviously they're not going to tell us much. So this is about being clever in this process and understanding that we need to give something to get something.
And it is then, to go back to the point made earlier, Robert Zarate, the onus is now on the countries with Iran to ease up, to show that Hassan Rouhani and the moderates are on the right track, and that what is needed now is more sanctions easing and more reward for the steps that have already been made.
Absolutely. This is a question of not only on our side, so to speak, but obviously the Iranians have to help their interlocutors. This is basically a situation where John Kerry and Javad Zarif are each other's best friends because they have more than enough enemies in their capitals who want to stop this. So that's why also they can't go home every time there's a negotiation round and gloat about whatever it is they got, because it's going to look their interlocutors look bad.
Robert Zarate, in Washington, it is then time for the powers gathered in Vienna to reward Tehran for what it's achieved so far.
To reward, I mean, there already is sanctions relief, if you want to call that a reward. But again, I am a critic of the interim agreement. I'm a constructive critic. I think there could have been a much better interim agreement that could have been negotiated with better terms. Here, I'll quote Ray Takei of the Council on Foreign Relations, who recently wrote, actually today in the Washington Post, the United States must stop underestimating its power, and this also the West, and overestimating Iran's resilience here. Iran was on the economic ropes. Prior to oil sanctions in 2012, and that's when they were first imposed, mind you, Iran was exporting about 2.5 million barrels per day in oil. After the 2012 oil sanctions started, it dropped to about 750,000 barrels per day. Today, it's risen to about 1.3 billion barrels per day. However, what's interesting, Hassan Rouhani, in his budget to the Iranian parliament, assumes a revenue base of about 1.5 million barrels per day of oil. Clearly, the Rouhani government is expecting more of a windfall from foreign governments in terms of sanctions relief. The worry here in Washington, D.C. is that this wall of sanctions relief, now that bricks have been pulled from it, may start to crumble. And this will actually incentivize Iran not to give concessions, not to deal with the issues of the potential military dimensions, its weapons-relevant nuclear activities that it hid from the world's gaze, which, contrary to Mr. Jokar, he and I can disagree without being disagreeable about this, these are central. And Mr. Parsi actually acknowledges these potential military dimensions are central to why we're here negotiating today, why there are sanctions. And until Iran has a clean bill of nuclear health, And there are going to be a lot of hurdles to get there. I just don't see this issue being resolved, and I worry that if you see hardliners in Tehran unwilling to concede, this will lead towards a really awful trajectory.
I do acknowledge that the possible military dimension expressed by the IAEA Board of Governor reports is an issue of concerns. It will be part of the deal, but the P5+1 will help.
It shouldn't be part of the deal.
It will help, no, because what we need to understand, Mr. Zarate, is that Iran is negotiating with the IAEA on the possible military dimension, and a senior U.S. official said yesterday in a press briefing that we are willing to help, but we are not willing to do the job of the IAEA. So the possible military dimension have to be addressed, but it has to be dealt with between Iran and the IAEA, and they're working on it. Secondly, I wanted to say that we will always find people opposed to an agreement, not happy with the current deal. The first interim agreement, of course, it is not complete, and we need to complete this with a comprehensive deal. And same in Iran. I mean, we can find lists in the West saying that Iran is not doing good on this part, on this issue, and same in Iran. If you listen to Iranian politicians, they also have the same list of issues of concerns regarding the other part. I know that Iranian hardliners say that, for example, I think it's Shariat Malari who said that, well, what we're getting back from like minor sanctions relief is they're sending us our own money, like $4.2 billion out of $100 billion that belongs to us. I mean, this is not a sanction relief. So Rouhani has to deal with these hardliners. This is very difficult. And I think that we should give them space. And we should not answer this question, are we optimistic or pessimistic? We have to be realist and try to find a way out of this unnecessary crisis that has been lasted for 10 years.
Rouzbeh Parsi, the fear, as was just expressed by Robert Zarate a moment ago, of those watching, the hawks watching this process, is that they believe the sanctions have worked, and any letting up of those sanctions, in a sense, gives too much room for maneuver to Tehran on the issue of its nuclear program.
Well, first of all, the possible military dimension, when I talk about it, it's in the past tense. It's not in the present tense. No one is at the moment, at least openly, claiming that Iran is doing any work on military stuff, as far as we know. And I think they would have if they thought it existed in the present. So we're talking more about the history of it rather than what's happening right now. Secondly, that's a contradiction in terms, in a sense, the way that the whole notion of sanctions is being phrased. Because on the one hand, people in DC claim that the sanctions are working very well, and then at the same time, they're afraid that Iran will draw out this process for several years. Well, if it's working as fine as they claim, then obviously Iran is in such dire straits, it would want all this ended in 6 months. And neither of those two versions of reality are quite accurate. Obviously, the sanctions are working in the sense that they're hitting Iran's economy. But that most politicians don't work with an Excel sheet where they decide, oh, this costs us this much, and therefore we're going to change what we're doing. So the Iranians do not feel that they're coming into these negotiations from a position of weakness, and neither is the US. So basically, both are expecting a lot from the other side and also expecting that they shouldn't give up too much themselves. And that's the difficult part of this process of negotiations. And it's going to take them a good 6 months to figure out that they are neither as strong nor as weak as they think or that the other side thinks.
Thank you very much. It brings us to the end of the debate, and Rouzbeh Parsi, on those words, what we can look forward to over the coming months as the issue is discussed. Sanam Shantyaei from France24, thank you for being with us. Also thanks to Milad Jokar for being with us, Rouzbeh Parsi as well, and Robert Zarate, who was down the line from Washington with us this evening. Thank you very much indeed for having joined us. It brings us to the end of tonight's debate. In just a minute, we'll be getting another look at the very latest headlines and all the latest, of course, from Kiev, where events have gotten more violent this evening. Indeed, it has seen the worst violence that the country has seen since the demonstrations began back in November. These are the live pictures coming from Ukraine, where the police have used water cannons and stun grenades to try and disperse some of the protesters who'd been in Independence Square. 9 people in all were killed today.